Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift into the dim glow of a world caught between fading medieval shadows and the slow rise of something modern. Something sharper, something more relentless. Tonight, we begin the long journey through the entire history of the 100 Years' War, a conflict so vast, so tangled in bloodlines. Betrayals, ambition, famine, prophecy, and fire, that even now it feels less like a war and more like a centuries-long storm passing over Europe. Imagine the year 1337, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, and uncertainty. As two kingdoms, England and France, quietly step toward a confrontation neither can fully control. No single moment begins this war. Instead, it creeps in like mist, curling through dynasties and ancient claims. Some chroniclers insist it was Edward III's claim to the French throne that lit the first spark. Others point to trade wars, political insults, and a deep rivalry stretching back to the Norman conquest. But whatever the cause, Europe begins to hold its breath. In candlelit halls, kings whisper over maps. On storm-beaten coasts, merchants count coin and dread disruption. Across muddy fields, peasants sense a disturbance in the old order, as if the ground beneath their feet knows that armies will soon march across it. The world is still medieval, but the edges are beginning to crack. New weapons, new tactics, new ideas shimmer on the horizon. And somewhere in the distance, in a future none of them can see, cannons will roar, kings will fall, saints will rise, and entire regions will be rebuilt from ash. Yet here, at the beginning, everything feels fragile, uncertain like the final. Deep breath before 1,000 storms break. Some scholars say the 100 Years' War wasn't truly one war, but a series of conflicts, stitched together by uneasy truces and restless ambitions. Others argue it was a single great struggle for identity, what it meant to be English, what it meant to be French, and who had the right to shape the destiny of a continent. As you slowly drift deeper into this story, allow the quiet weight of the era to settle around youth, a clatter of armor being repaired, the rustle of parchment treaties, the distant chanting of monks asking heaven to stop what's coming. Because this is only the beginning, and in the next section, we step directly into the throne rooms where ambition first begins to whisper its dangerous promises. Now, let us step into the shadowed throne rooms of early 14th century Europe, where ambition simmers behind tapestries and stone walls, and the delicate balance of power hangs by a whisper of diplomacy. France, a kingdom vast and rich, ruled by the Capetian line, feels the tremors of uncertainty as Charles IV dies without a male heir in 1328, leaving the French crown vulnerable to claims both distant and bold. Edward III of England, a young king with the fire of lineage and the weight of inherited ambition, casts his eyes across the Channel, calculating, patient, and poised. Some historians suggest that Edward's claim is weak, distant, almost a ghost of right, but to him it is opportunity. Others note that the French nobility, wary of foreign rule, invoke the Salic law, forbidding inheritance through the female line to block him, solidifying internal divisions. Imagine the dim corridors, the echoing footsteps, the whispered consultations with advisors and ambassadors, each carrying letters, seals, and promises. The air scented faintly of ink and burning tallow. Outside, in villages and market towns, life continues in fragile routines, oblivious to the looming storm. yet slowly being pulled into the orbit of dynastic maneuvering. Taxes are collected with increasing efficiency, record-keeping grows meticulous, and armies, once temporary gatherings of feudal levies, begin the quiet evolution toward something professional, something that will change the very face of warfare. French administrators established depots and contracts with craftsmen, standardizing equipment and ammunition, while English commanders, clinging to older methods, maintain armies funded by extraordinary taxation and borrowing from Italian banking. Houses, creating tensions between crown and parliament, crown and citizen. Some suggest that these quiet developments, the paperwork, the contracts, the rolling of barrels of powder and stockpiling of arrows, were as decisive as the battles to come, shaping the ways both kingdoms could wage war over decades. As we peer into these early years, sense the anticipation, the tension, the weight of inevitability. Noble families wonder whether loyalty will secure their futures or doom them. Peasants brace for requisitions and conscriptions they barely understand. And the river of history begins to surge, inexorably toward campaigns, sieges, famine, and victory. And yet, even as the first arrows are strung and first declarations are penned, the true nature of this centuries-long war's human cost, the technological innovations, the rise and fall of cities and kingdoms remains veiled, waiting to be revealed. Next, we move from the throne rooms into the first thunder of conflict, where England casts its ambitions into the open, and the fields of northern France become the silent witnesses to history's unfolding drama, the first volleys of the 100. Years' war erupt with a quiet intensity that belies the decades of suffering to come, beginning in the rolling plains and dense forests of northern France, where English forces, organized around long-standing feudal structures, yet increasingly funded through innovative taxation, step onto the soil of their contested claim. Picture the banners flapping against a cold, misty dawn, the leather and steel of armor glinting in muted light, horses stamping the earth as knights and men-at-arms assemble, bowstrings taut, and the low hum of anticipation hangs over the encampments. Edward III, youthful and determined, surveys his forces with a mixture of calculation and bravado, aware that every step, every requisition, every march across hostile territory will strain his kingdom's finances and test the loyalty of both. Nobles and common soldiers. Some chroniclers describe the English army as disciplined yet rigid, relying heavily on the devastating accuracy of the longbow, a weapon that can pierce armor with lethal efficiency, while French commanders, divided among competing noble houses, scrambled to adapt, deploying armored knights and hastily gathered levies, their tactics shaped by centuries-old conventions increasingly unsuited to the evolving battlefield. The initial campaigns, including the famous victories at Sluys and Crécy, unfold with dramatic contrasts, English arrows raining like a dark, endless storm over French cavalry, the air filled with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and smoke from burning villages, while French horses stumble over churned mud, commanders shouting orders that are often lost amid chaos. It is in these early encounters that the seeds of professionalization are sown. Supply lines are tested, garrisons must be provisioned, and the mathematics of logistics begins to dictate the rhythm of war rather than mere chance or heroic valor. Civilian populations, meanwhile, are caught between armies, subjected to levies, forced contributions, and the terror of scorched earth tactics intended to deny resources to the enemy. Some historians argue that these early campaigns reveal more than military skill. They expose the economic and administrative foundations of medieval states, showing which monarchs can harness wealth, bureaucracy, and human resources to devastating effect. And yet, despite victories and humiliations alike, the war's outcome remains far from certain. The young English king's ambitions will collide repeatedly with the resilience, ingenuity, and growing professionalization of French forces, each battle a note in a longer, darker symphony of conflict that will shape generations. From these initial clashes, we move next to the systematic devastation of the French countryside, the sieges that test human endurance and the creeping shadow of famine and displacement that will forever alter the social landscape of medieval Europe. As the war grinds on, the French countryside becomes a landscape of quiet terror and slow decay. Fields once golden with grain, now trampled by marching armies. Villages reduced to charred timbers and smouldering hearths, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke and the muted cries of displaced families. Farmers abandon their ancestral lands, carrying what little they can, fleeing from one advancing army only to meet another, while livestock roam untended, their lowing echoing across empty pastures, a haunting reminder of lives uprooted. The English, seeking to weaken French economic capacity and morale, employs scorched earth tactics with ruthless efficiency, systematically destroying crops, mills, and wine presses, leaving behind a patchwork of devastation that disrupts centuries-old agricultural systems. Some settlements are abandoned entirely, their stone foundations crumbling into silent ruins, while others are repurposed as garrisons, supply depots, or forced settlements for loyal colonists, a calculated effort to assert control over conquered territories. In regions like Normandy and the Loire Valley, contemporary records speak of entire communities erased, the population either slain, displaced, or subjugated, creating demographic catastrophes that will take decades to recover. These acts of destruction ripple beyond the immediate theater of war. Trade networks collapse as merchants abandon dangerous routes, marketplaces fall silent, and specialized craftsmen vanish, taking with them knowledge essential for sustaining local economies. Yet within this chaos, a new form of military organization emerges. French forces, increasingly professionalized, begin to consolidate permanent garrisons, develop supply depots, and standardize equipment, while commanders and their staff refine tactical doctrines to counter English advances. At the same time, both kingdoms face the staggering financial demands of prolonged warfare. English campaigns, funded through parliamentary subsidies, customs duties, and innovative taxation on wool exports, strain royal coffers, while France, drawing upon its larger population and centralized administration, experiments with permanent taxation and financial instruments that ensure armies remain provisioned and operational. Beyond the battlefield, the social fabric of France transforms. Veteran communities, military families, and displaced populations create new social dynamics, blending fear, loyalty, and necessity in ways that will shape regional identities for generations. And yet, amid suffering and upheaval, the tide of resilience begins to turn. French forces learn, adapt, and professionalize, their victories slowly reclaiming lost territory and restoring hope to a nation bruised but unbroken. From the ashes of devastation, the stage is set for the next phase of conflict. The rise of charismatic leadership, unexpected reversals, and the dramatic campaigns that will come to define the middle years of the 100 Years' War, a period where strategy, logistics, and human endurance collide in ways both harrowing and extraordinary. As the mid-14th century unfolds, the war takes on a new intensity, and leadership becomes as decisive as swords and arrows. Edward III of England, determined to maintain his claim to the French throne, marshals forces with precision, exploiting naval control, longbow mastery, and carefully timed campaigns, his soldiers moving like shadows across the countryside, striking swiftly, then disappearing into the mists of morning. Some researchers suggest that the longbow, with its ability to pierce armor at unexpected ranges, becomes the symbol of English tactical ingenuity, while others argue that its psychological impact on French knights once untouchable in their heavy plate creates a demoralizing effect as much as its physical lethality. Meanwhile, in France, the devastation wrought by English raids forces a re-evaluation of defensive strategy. French commanders begin to invest in fortified towns, reorganize regional militia, and experiment with early artillery, cannons that roar across the battlefield and shatter traditional stone fortifications, their explosive impact sending clouds of dust and terror in equal measure. The interplay of technology, logistics, and morale becomes evident as campaigns extend across hundreds of miles, where supply lines are tested. Horses strain under the weight of provisions, and soldiers march for days through rain-soaked fields and muddy roads, the rhythm of war dictated as much by weather and terrain as by human ambition. Back in England, the financial pressures of sustaining these campaigns force innovation. Parliamentary subsidies are carefully calculated, wool taxes meticulously recorded, and loans negotiated with Italian banking houses, linking the fortunes of merchants, nobility, and crown in a delicate, high-stakes dance that underpins the machinery of war. On the social front, families of soldiers navigate uncertainty, their identities shifting as the distinction between civilian and military life blurs. Veteran soldiers return with specialized skills, forming communities bound by shared experience and the haunting memories of siege and slaughter. In cities like Calais, captured after long sieges, the presence of English garrisons introduces foreign law, language, and culture, creating enclaves of contested authority and setting the stage for tensions that simmer for decades. Amid these complex layers of strategy, finance, and society, individual acts of leadership emerge as decisive commanders like the Black Prince demonstrate the interplay of daring, timing, and political acumen. Their victories not merely the result of force, but of calculated mastery over the many moving parts of war. And yet, as both kingdoms strain under the burden of prolonged conflict, questions linger in the minds of soldiers, civilians, and kings alike. Who will endure? Who will adapt? And which innovations be, their technological, organizational, or cultural, will ultimately tip the scales in this sprawling, centuries-long struggle that has already reshaped the very face of Europe? The year 1356 brings one of the most pivotal moments of the conflict. A day etched in both terror and legend, when the Battle of Poitiers unfolds under a grey, oppressive sky that seems to mirror the uncertainty of the age. Edward the Black, Prince, leads the English forces with a combination of disciplined formation and audacious risk, while the French, under King John II, marched with the confidence of numerical superiority, their banners snapping sharply in the cold wind, the clatter of armor and hooves echoing across the rolling fields. Some historians suggest that the English victory hinges on the careful positioning of men-at-arms and archers in hidden defiles and hedgerows, turning natural terrain into a trap, while others highlight the fractured coordination among French nobles, their orders delayed, and their charges colliding in chaotic bursts that crumble morale. Arrows darken the sky like falling rain, striking down knights in glinting armor, their screams mingling with the thunder of hooves and the groans of the wounded. A scene so vivid that accounts from both sides convey horror alongside awe. The aftermath is staggering. King John II himself is captured, a crown weighed down not just by gold, but by the burden of his defeat. Destined for imprisonment in England, while the French countryside reels from the devastation of raiding ransoms and scorched lands that leave townsfolk shivering in ruined homes. Political ramifications ripple outward. The English, emboldened, negotiate a complex web of treaties and ransoms, weaving economic leverage with psychological pressure, while in France, a regency struggles to maintain cohesion. Taxation rises to fund desperate defenses, and whispers of rebellion begin to stir in provinces already drained by years of warfare. Beyond the battlefield, the battle's legend grows in the telling. Chroniclers embellish heroism, valor, and betrayal there, words shaping memory as much as reality, leaving modern readers and listeners to wonder where fact ends and narrative begins. For ordinary soldiers, Poitiers becomes a tale of endurance and terror, where survival hinges on quick thinking and sheer luck, and where the line between triumph and death is as thin as a longbow string. And as we consider the staggering scale of human cost to captives, the widows, the orphan children, and the echoing consequences of this single clash, one is forced to ask, in a war that spans decades, where victories are fleeting and strategies constantly evolve, how does a single day, a single battlefield, redefine the destinies of nations and the lives of those caught in the relentless tide of history? Following the shattering events at Poitiers, the 100 Years' War takes on an even more tangled and uncertain character, a slow-burning tension that smolders across the landscapes of France and England, where forests, rivers, and walled towns alike become arenas of strategy, terror, and survival. With King John II imprisoned in England, France is left under the rule of his son, the Dauphin Charles, whose youth and inexperience leave him navigating treacherous political currents, balancing the ambitions of powerful nobles and attempting to rally a nation exhausted by decades of intermittent warfare. Some historians argue that this period marks a turning point in the psychological aspect of the war, where morale, rumor, and perception begin to matter as much as armies and armor, while others suggest that the French crown's weakened authority accelerates the rise of mercenary bands and private armies, whose loyalties are bought with coin, and whose paths of pillage cut unpredictable swaths across the countryside. Meanwhile, the English consolidate gains in territories such as Aquitaine and Poitou, exploiting both their technological advantage with the longbow and the fractured state of French defense. Entire villages whisper under the shadow of foreign banners. Farmers hide in cellars as mounted raiders sweep through markets, carrying away livestock, grain, and the fragile certainty of daily life. In towns and courts, The flow of information is both weapon and hazard. News of victories and defeats travels slowly, colored by exaggeration, fear, and hope, while letters and envoys crisscross the channel, negotiating ransoms, alliances, and truces that rarely hold more than a season. Across the landscape, the scars of conflict become part of the natural rhythm of life. The forests bear the marks of burned encampments, the roads are littered with abandoned wagons, and the churches, once havens, serve as temporary hospitals or shelters, the scent of smoke and iron heavy in the air. Economically, the pressure is unrelenting. Taxation rises to fund armies. Trade falters under threat of raids, and coin becomes both lifeline and chain, binding peasants and merchants alike to a war that feels endless. And yet, amid despair, glimmers of resilience appear. Local militias form to protect towns, negotiations for peace flicker with cautious hope, and chroniclers, scribes, and poets turn war into story, capturing the terror, heroism, and futility in words that echo through time. As we move from these chaotic years of uncertainty toward new campaigns and dramatic confrontations, one cannot help but wonder, how does a nation fractured by fear and ambition find the strength to rise, to resist, and to endure in a conflict that seems determined to consume all in its path? As the years press on, the stage shifts toward the mid-14th century, where the 100 Years' War evolves into a war of attrition. A slow, grinding conflict in which sieges, raids, and the occasional pitched battle dominate the rhythm of life, leaving both nations drained yet unbowed. The English, emboldened by their victories at Crécy and Poitiers, consolidate their hold over vast stretches of French territory, but maintaining these lands proves as formidable a task as capturing them. Garrisoned castles and fortified towns dot the French countryside like scattered islands of control, each one a microcosm of tension, vigilance, and sporadic violence. Some researchers suggest that the war begins to transform from a purely dynastic struggle into something more diffuse, where local power, family feuds, and economic interest intersect with the ambitions of kings, creating a tangled web of loyalty and betrayal that stretches across hundreds of miles. In France, the Dauphin Charles, now approaching maturity, faces a kingdom fractured not only by foreign invasion but by famine, disease, and a population wearied by decades of uncertainty. The Black Death, arriving in 1347, sweeps through towns and villages, claiming lives in numbers that make the previous battles seem almost secondary in their scale of destruction, leaving empty homes, silent fields, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. English soldiers, often mercenaries or archers drawn from humble backgrounds, find themselves both conquerors and caretakers of lands, whose populations view them with suspicion, fear, and occasional defiance, while French nobles oscillate between negotiating with occupiers and plotting rebellion. Amid this turbulence, the technology of war evolves quietly but decisively. The English longbow remains a terrifying equalizer on the battlefield, capable of piercing armor at surprising distances, while siege engines, crossbows, and emerging artillery begin to alter how fortifications are designed and attacked. And yet, beyond the clashing swords and flying arrows, life continues in quieter, more intimate forms. Peasants plant fields while glancing warily at distant smoke on the horizon. Markets bustle with the cautious exchange of goods and the sound of bells calling the faithful, warning of approaching raiders, marking the passage of time echoes across the misty landscapes. The psychological toll is immense. Rumors of massacres, ransoms, and betrayals spread faster than armies, shaping fear, loyalty, and resistance. From one shadowed valley to the next fortified town, the war becomes an unending test of endurance, patience, and cunning. And as the war grinds onward, one question persists, lingering like the fog over a river at dawn. Who, if anyone, can truly claim victory in a conflict that consumes generations and reshapes the very land it is fought upon? By the late 14th century, the war begins to take on an almost mercurial quality, shifting unpredictably between moments of intense confrontation and prolonged periods of uneasy truce, as both England and France grapple not only with each other, but with the deeper currents of political instability and social unrest within their own borders. The English crown, flush with the spoils of early victories, finds its authority tested by internal disputes over succession and governance, while in France, the monarchy struggles to assert control over a patchwork of semi-independent provinces, each ruled by nobles whose loyalties are often as fluid as the rivers that carve through the French countryside. Some historians suggest that these internal divisions, more than any single battle, shaped the course of the war, creating opportunities for daring raids, shifting alliances, and unexpected reversals of fortune. At the same time, the introduction of new military strategies and tactics begins to reshape how battles are fought. Large-scale cavalry charges, once considered decisive, are increasingly countered by disciplined infantry formations and the relentless rain of longbow arrows, while fortified towns and castles become both bastions of defense and focal points of attrition, where siegecraft is an art as well as a science. The human cost is staggering. Peasants are conscripted into armies, ransomed, or forced from their homes, their lives reduced to a fragile oscillation between survival and despair, while nobles maneuver through a complex dance of honor, obligation, and ambition, aware that a single mistake can mean death on the battlefield or in the shadowed halls of a rival's keep. Disease, starvation, and economic disruption ripple across the countryside, further intensifying the hardships of war, and yet life continues, stubbornly persistent. Children play in ruined streets, merchants trade in quiet corners, and priests offer solace in the flickering candlelight of churches that echo with both hope and lamentation. Amidst this turbulent backdrop, figures emerge whose actions will become legend. Knights whose bravery seems larger than life, strategists whose cunning turns the tide of campaigns, and ordinary soldiers who endure beyond what seems humanly possible. From the charred fields of contested lands to the silent corridors of castles where whispered plots take root, the conflict deepens, entangling generations in a cycle of violence, uncertainty, and ambition. And as we gaze across these decades of struggle, one cannot help but wonder, in a war defined by relentless motion, shifting power, and unending human suffering, what force, if any, truly holds the upper hand, and what fate awaits those who are merely caught in its unyielding grip? As the 15th century dawns, the 100 Years' War enters a new and unsettling phase, a period marked less by grand battles and more by cunning strategy, siege, and the slow erosion of old assumptions about warfare and power. England, still basking in the afterglow of earlier victories, yet stretched thin by distant campaigns, faces increasing difficulties in maintaining control over its French territories. Supply lines are long and vulnerable, local resistance simmering in towns and villages that have endured decades of occupation. And the once formidable English nobility begins to fracture under the weight of internal disputes and the strain of repeated campaigns. Meanwhile, France, bruised but not broken, starts to find a renewed sense of purpose, with a monarchy determined to reclaim lost lands and assert authority over nobles, whose loyalties have wavered in the shifting tides of fortune. Some scholars suggest that this resurgence is aided not only by leadership but by the slow but inevitable evolution of national identity, a sense of belonging and shared fate that transcends regional allegiances and sparks a quiet but powerful unity among people who have lived through generations of invasion and instability. It is during this period that we begin to see the rise of unconventional figures, those whose courage, vision, or sheer unpredictability begins to alter the course of the conflict. Soldiers who fight with a ferocity that borders on the supernatural. Strategists whose plans seem to anticipate the enemy's every move. And messengers of rumor and prophecy who can influence morale as effectively as any sword or arrow. The countryside, meanwhile, bears the heavy scars of decades of war, fields left fallow, towns reduced to rubble, rivers swollen with the detritus of burned villages, and forests cleared or shrouded in shadows where guerrilla bands may lie in wait. Disease continues to follow the armies, striking both soldiers and civilians, a reminder that in this long, grinding war, human suffering is constant and impartial. Yet even amidst this devastation, life persists in quiet. Tenacious ways families rebuild homes, markets reopen in cautious optimism, and faith endures in the flickering lights of chapels and monasteries, offering solace to those who have survived yet another winter of uncertainty. As these years unfold, the lines between heroism and tragedy blur, and one is left with an unnerving question. When a war has lasted generations and reshaped entire societies, can anyone truly claim victory, or are all caught in the slow, inexorable pull of a conflict that seems larger than life itself? As the conflict trudges deeper into the 15th century, we encounter a figure whose name would ripple through history with an almost mythic resonance. Joan of Arc. She emerges not as a seasoned commander or noblewoman, but as a young peasant girl from Domremy, claiming to hear voices' divine instructions guiding her toward a destiny that seems impossibly grand against the backdrop of a nation torn apart. Some historians argue that Joan's visions were a product of intense religious fervor. Others suggest a psychological phenomenon, yet all accounts agree that her presence injected a renewed vigor into the French cause at a moment when despair threatened to swallow the realm. Clad in makeshift armor, she moves through towns and battlefields with a confidence that defies her age, her voice rallying troops whose morale had long been eroded by successive defeats. Her strategic influence is remarkable. If enigmatic, she persuades commanders to act boldly, inspires citizens to support the crown, and leads soldiers in campaigns that, even when bloody, carry a sense of purpose far beyond mere conquest. The siege of Orleans in 1429 becomes a defining episode, a collision of faith, courage, and circumstance where the improbable becomes reality, and a beleaguered city rises as a symbol of resistance. The air is thick with smoke, the clash of swords reverberating through narrow streets, and the cries of the wounded mingling with chants of victory as French forces, driven by her presence, begin to turn the tide. Yet Joan's story is not one of unbroken triumph. It is a narrative interwoven with political intrigue, betrayal, and the precariousness of fame in a world governed by rigid hierarchies and suspicion. Eventually captured, tried, and condemned by the English and their allies, her fate becomes a chilling reminder of how quickly fortune can reverse, how easily the line between savior and scapegoat can blur. Even in death, the legend she leaves behind cannot be extinguished. It festers, evolves, and strengthens the very national spirit she had sought to awaken. As the French rally around her memory, one is compelled to ask, how can the will of a single individual, fragile in body yet monumental in influence, shift the course of a war that has consumed decades and countless lives? And what does this tell us about the nature of courage, destiny, and the forces that shape history itself? With Joan of Arc's capture and eventual execution, the 100 Years' War does not pause. Instead, it drifts into a period of grim endurance, where the exhaustion of both armies and populations sets the stage for new strategies, shifting alliances, and an ever-deepening human cost. France, though invigorated by the brief spark of hope she ignited, remains a patchwork of contested territories, towns still under English occupation, and lords whose loyalty is fragile and negotiable. The war begins to transition from monumental battles to a series of smaller sieges, skirmishes, and tactical maneuvers that are no less brutal but far less celebrated. A grinding attrition that wears down morale as much as it does manpower. Armies are not merely tools of conquest now. They are instruments of survival, moving through villages and farmlands, often leaving hunger, disease, and fear in their wake. Some researchers note that these years marked a turning point in military organization, as the reliance on heavily armored knights diminishes in favor of longbowmen, crossbowmen, and more mobile infantry units capable of rapid strikes, ambushes, and scorched earth tactics. Economic pressures reshape the landscape too. Taxation rises, markets falter, and entire regions face famine as both sides extract resources to maintain the war effort. Diplomacy becomes as crucial as battlefield prowess, with marriages, treaties, and the subtle play of power between dukes and kings determining who controls which patch of land. Through it all, the common people live in an uneasy limbo, caught between loyalty to their local lords and survival in an environment where allegiances shift like the wind. Letters, chronicles, and eyewitness accounts from this era often describe a muted despair, a sense that the war is both endless and invisible to those outside the corridors of power. Yet amidst the monotony of prolonged conflict, moments of daring or cruelty still punctuate the years. A surprise night attack here, a brutal siege there, each capable of tipping the fragile scales of fortune. Observers of the period frequently remark on the psychological toll of this drawn-out struggle, where fear, hope, and uncertainty coexist in every village and encampment, shaping decisions and allegiances in ways no commander can fully predict. As we trace the war toward its final phase, one cannot help but wonder, how does a kingdom, fractured and battered for decades, muster the resilience to finally emerge from the shadow of unending conflict? And what unseen forces strategy, circumstance, or sheer human will guide the conclusion of an era defined by relentless uncertainty? As the war drags into its final decades, the landscape of France and England becomes a mosaic of contested territories, fractured loyalties, and the lingering echoes of past victories and defeats, where every castle, village, and battlefield tells a story of suffering and resilience. The English crown, under successive monarchs, struggles to maintain its claims in France, facing not only the tenacity of French, resistance, but also internal pressures from a kingdom that has grown weary of constant taxation and endless campaigns. Meanwhile, France undergoes a slow but profound transformation. The monarchy, once weak and overshadowed by powerful nobles, begins to consolidate authority, learning from decades of chaos that centralization may be the key to survival. The lingering effects of Joan of Arc's campaigns continue to inspire a sense of national identity, even as her martyrdom casts a long shadow over the psyche of the people. A reminder that heroism often comes with unimaginable cost. Military tactics continue to evolve. Longbowmen dominate open fields, sieges become more sophisticated, and the use of early artillery begins to hint at the shape of future warfare, though still crude and unpredictable. Diplomats, merchants, and spies weave an invisible network across both kingdoms, moving intelligence, negotiating truces, and plotting betrayals, their work often as decisive as any sword or cannon. The war's human toll is staggering. Villages lie depopulated. Famine and disease spread through camps and towns alike, and families live in perpetual uncertainty, their livelihoods destroyed by raids, scorched fields, and the constant threat of conscription. Chroniclers of the time describe scenes of quiet desperation, children wandering through abandoned streets, the smell of unburied corpses after a skirmish, the hollow eyes of peasants who have endured decades of violence. Yet the records also hint at remarkable resilience, small acts of kindness, and the determination of communities to survive despite everything. As the English grip falters and French forces reclaim key territories, the momentum shifts subtly but inexorably, like the slow turning of a tide that has been building for years. Scholars debate the extent to which luck, leadership, or sheer persistence determined these outcomes. But what is certain is that the war's final chapters will be written not only on the battlefield, but also in the hearts and minds of a population that has endured nearly a century of unrelenting uncertainty. And so, as we edge closer to the war's conclusion, one must ask, can a kingdom scarred by decades of conflict truly heal? Or are the wounds of the 100 Years' War destined to linger, shaping the destiny of Europe for generations to come? By the mid-15th century, the 100 Years' War has become a contest of attrition as much as strategy, with the physical and psychological toll on both kingdoms reaching its peak. The English, once confident in their claim to French lands, are increasingly constrained by financial exhaustion and internal dissent, while the French crown, emboldened by recovered territories and a renewed sense of national unity, begins to experiment with more coordinated military campaigns, combining the strength of professional soldiers with the mobilization of local militias. The landscape itself bears the scars of decades of conflict. Fields are left fallow, towns bear the evidence of repeated sieges, and forests, once dense with life, are cleared to supply timber for fortifications and weapons. Armies move like shadows across this fractured land, relying on both the traditional longbow and emerging gunpowder artillery. Their movements dictated as much by the need to forage and maintain supply lines as by tactical objectives, turning the art of war into a brutal logistical puzzle. Among these armies, morale becomes as decisive as skill. Troops hardened by experience sometimes collapse under the weight of endless marching, disease, and exposure, while commanders must navigate not only enemy forces, but also the fragile loyalty of their own men, whose patience and endurance are tested by the slow grind of a conflict that has outlasted generations. Diplomacy weaves another layer of complexity. Treaties are proposed, promises exchanged, and marriages arranged to solidify alliances. Yet betrayal and shifting loyalties remain constants, and every accord carries the weight of suspicion, for trust is a rare commodity in this era. Peasants and townsfolk, caught in the crossfire, become both victims and opportunists, sometimes resisting occupation, sometimes negotiating survival with invaders. Their resilience, a quiet counterpoint to the spectacle of kings and knights. Chroniclers describe eerie quiets between battles, where the devastation left behind transforms familiar landscapes into surreal tableaux. Burned villages, abandoned carts, and silent churches whose bells have long ceased to ring. A haunting reminder of the human cost hidden behind maps and proclamations. As winter approaches in one of these years, armies hunker down in makeshift encampments, fires flickering against cold stone walls, soldiers whispering rumors of approaching campaigns while beyond their sight. Kings and nobles plot moves that could alter the balance of power yet again. And so, as the stage is set for the closing acts of this century-spanning conflict, one must wonder when the final blows are struck. Will Europe emerge as a continent united under new powers? Or will the shadows of this protracted war continue to shape the destinies of those who survived its relentless march? As the 1450s unfold, the 100 Years' War edges toward its final chapters. Yet the tension and uncertainty that have defined decades of conflict remain thick in the air. The English, reeling from repeated defeats in key territories like Normandy and Guyenne, face not only the collapse of their continental ambitions, but also growing unrest at home, where noble rivalries and political factions gnaw at the stability of the crown, leaving their military campaigns increasingly underfunded and undermanned. While across the Channel, the French monarchy consolidates power, taking lessons from the chaos of earlier decades to build a more centralized authority, capable of mobilizing resources efficiently, leveraging both professional soldiers and peasant levies in ways previously unimaginable. The rhythm of war has changed. No longer are massive pitched battles as frequent, but sieges, skirmishes, and strategic blockades dominate the tactical landscape, testing ingenuity as much as courage, while new technologies, particularly gunpowder, artillery, begin to reshape fortifications and challenge the dominance of traditional castles and walled cities, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty for both attackers and defenders who must adapt or perish. In the villages and towns of France and England, life continues under the shadow of war. Markets reopen between campaigns, yet merchants calculate risks with every caravan sent across contested lands. Farmers rebuild fences and barns destroyed in previous raids, and common folk develop an almost instinctive awareness of approaching armies. The clatter of hooves and distant horns a signal to hide or flee, while chroniclers and poets continue to immortalize these experiences, capturing not only heroics but also the pervasive fear, fatigue, and sometimes dark humor of those trapped in an unending conflict. Diplomacy remains as elusive as ever. Envoys shuttle between courts, treaties are drawn up and broken, and marriages are arranged as chess-like moves to cement alliances. Yet the fragility of such agreements mirrors the instability of the era itself. Beyond the battlefield, the psychological impact is profound. Generations have grown up knowing nothing but war, with memory and myth intertwining, giving rise to legends of heroic deeds, mysterious apparitions, and tales of betrayal that blur the line between history and folklore. And as the sun sets over the war-torn landscapes of France, casting long shadows over ruined abbeys and shattered fortresses. One cannot help but sense that the final resolution of this century-long struggle is near, that the fates of kings and commoners alike hang in a delicate balance, and that the coming years will reveal whether. By the late 1450s, the momentum of the 100 Years' War has shifted almost entirely in favor of the French, yet the path to absolute victory is neither smooth nor immediate. The English, once dominant across northern France, cling to strongholds such as Calais, their presence a stubborn reminder of centuries of struggle, while across the French countryside, towns and villages bear the scars of decades of occupation, looting and shifting loyalties, creating a complex mosaic of resentment, pragmatism and cautious optimism, where some local lords quietly align with whichever power promises protection and stability. Amid this backdrop, the role of Joan of Arc, though physically absent from the battlefield for several years, continues to resonate. Her campaigns have reinvigorated French morale, inspired new waves of volunteers, and challenged centuries-old notions of divine favor, kingship, and the legitimacy of rule, leaving historians and chroniclers debating the extent to which her presence, or even her legend, truly altered the course of the war. Meanwhile, the English crown, weakened by internal strife and the looming Wars of the Roses, struggles to maintain consistent support for its French campaigns, relying increasingly on mercenaries and local levies, who are often poorly paid and poorly disciplined, creating tensions that undermine strategic coherence. On the technological front, cannons and early firearms continue to transform the nature of sieges, reducing the effectiveness of traditional castle walls and changing the calculus of both attack and defense. While knights in full armor, once the epitome of military supremacy, find their dominance waning in the face of longbowmen pike formations and gunpowder weapons, forcing adaptations that redefine the experience of war for everyone, from noble commanders to foot soldiers. In towns caught between armies, daily life oscillates between moments of cautious normalcy and sudden terror. Markets reopen. Children play in courtyards scarred by previous skirmishes. Yet the distant rumble of drums or the flash of banners over a hill can transform familiar streets into corridors of fear and uncertainty. Diplomacy remains a fragile art. Envoys traverse dangerous territories, treaties are drafted and dissolved with alarming frequency, and marriages continue to be instruments of political strategy, binding families and kingdoms into tenuous networks of obligation. The psychological weight of decades of warfare begins to permeate every corner of society. Chroniclers write not only of victories and losses, but also of exhaustion, grief, and the slow erosion of faith in leaders and institutions. And as the sun dips behind the ruined fortresses and scarred fields, casting long, almost spectral shadows across the landscape, the question lingers in every mind: what will the final resolution bring? And will the century-long struggle finally yield peace, or merely the illusion of it, leaving future generations to inherit the memory of war in their bones? As the 1460s approach, the 100 Years' War teeters on its final acts. Yet the human and political drama is far from concluded. For the French crown, now more confident and centralized under Charles VII, begins systematically reclaiming territories once lost to English occupation, using a combination of professionalized armies, strategic fortifications, and psychological warfare to erode resistance without always resorting to open battle, while the English, beset by internal divisions, dynastic disputes, and financial exhaustion, are increasingly reduced to defending isolated enclaves like Calais, struggling to project power across a hostile countryside where ambushes, scorched earth tactics, and local uprisings undermine their authority at every turn, creating a sense of inevitability that the war's outcome may finally be decided not in pitched battles, but in the slow, relentless attrition of resources, morale, and legitimacy. Within this context, the legacy of Joan of Arc continues to ripple through France, her martyrdom transforming her into a symbol that transcends the battlefield. Sermons, poems, and songs elevate her image as a divinely guided figure, blending history and myth, inspiring troops and civilians alike to endure and resist, while in English circles, her memory becomes a cautionary tale, a haunting reminder that charisma and faith can shift the tide of conflict in ways even the most calculated generals cannot predict. Meanwhile, innovations in military strategy and technology continue to redefine warfare. Artillery becomes more mobile. Longbowmen integrate with pike formations, and the logistics of feeding, arming, and moving professional armies grow increasingly sophisticated, creating a landscape where knowledge, preparation, and timing are as decisive as courage or strength. In the towns and villages scarred by generations of conflict, life slowly begins to take on a tentative rhythm. Blackened ruins are rebuilt. Trade cautiously resumes along roads once too dangerous to traverse, and communities negotiate complex relationships with whichever power currently dominates their region, balancing survival against loyalty, hope, and fear. Diplomacy, too, reaches its crucial moments, with envoys and secret negotiations seeking to formalize peace and solidify borders, while the English monarchy, weary and fragmented, must contend with pressures at home that increasingly limit its ability to influence events across the Channel. As the final sieges unfold and banners of both nations flutter across battered landscapes, the sense of an ending grows palpable, yet questions remain. Will France emerge truly unified? Or will the wounds of war linger in politics and culture for generations to come? Will the English retreat mark the conclusion of centuries of struggle, or merely the beginning of a new, subtler contest for dominance? In this tense, uncertain atmosphere, the shadows of the past and the possibilities of the future intertwine, leaving all who witnessed or remembered the war suspended in a delicate balance between closure and lingering mystery, the echoes of conflict still resonating in every stone, field, and heartbeat of the land. As we move closer to the final chapters of the 100 Years' War, the siege of Castellon in 1453 emerges as both a tactical and symbolic turning point, where the clash between tradition and innovation, courage and calculation, seems to crystallize in a single fateful moment. The French army, now well equipped with cannons and trained artillery crews, positions itself along the heights overlooking the English encampment, the rumble of stone and iron echoing across the valley, while the English, under the command of John Talbot, march forward with a blend of confidence, desperation, and pride in their centuries-long campaign, unaware that the very nature of warfare is shifting beneath their feet, that the tools and strategies that brought victory in the past may now become instruments of their undoing. The battle begins with a tense stillness, the air thick with smoke, the smell of wet earth and gunpowder mingling as lines of infantry and cavalry advance, arrows whistling, and the thunderous roar of cannons shaking the ground beneath both armies, creating a disorienting and chaotic atmosphere where heroism, miscalculation, and sheer luck intermingle with devastating consequence. Talbot himself, a figure almost mythic in English memory, rides at the forefront, embodying the martial ideal of courage and honor. Yet his determination meets the relentless efficiency of the French artillery, which rains destruction upon the advancing troops, fracturing formations, breaking morale, and turning the terrain itself into a trap where every hill and hollow seems to conspire against the English advance. As the day unfolds, the English forces crumble under the combination of firepower, exhaustion, and the growing realization that the tide has irrevocably turned. And when Talbot falls, struck down in the chaos, it signals more than the loss of a commander. It marks the symbolic collapse of an era, the final gasp of England's expansive ambitions on French soil, and the closing of a century-long cycle of war, suffering, and resilience. In the aftermath, the landscape bears the scars of conflict, shattered fortifications, fields littered with weapons, and the lingering silence punctuated only by distant cries and the slow, methodical work of clearing the dead and wounded. Observers and chroniclers alike record the battle in hushed, reverent tones, some framing it as divine judgment, others as the inevitable consequence of strategic evolution and human error, leaving future generations to ponder not just who won, but why and how such monumental events reshaped nations, identities, and the very perception of war itself. And as the sun sets over Castellon, casting long shadows across a battlefield that will never be forgotten, one cannot help but ask what truly defines the end of a war, the fall of kings, the surrender of lands, or the quiet persistence of memory and legacy in those who survive. With the fall of Talbot and the decisive outcome at Castellon, the stage is set for a slow, almost imperceptible shift from open conflict to uneasy peace. A transition marked not by grand ceremonies, but by weary armies trudging home, towns attempting to rebuild, and rulers recalibrating their ambitions in the shadow of a war that has lasted more than a century. France, having endured the strain of occupation, devastation, and intermittent famine, begins to consolidate its fragmented territories, reasserting royal authority over regions that once teetered on the edge of independence or English allegiance, while the English crown, battered by military defeat and internal political tension, turns inward, its gaze drawn to domestic unrest, succession disputes, and the simmering seeds of what will later erupt into civil strife, leaving the distant continent of France to recover and redefine itself without external interference. Economically, the war has left both kingdoms strained, but France, through a combination of strategic taxation, prudent management, and the reintegration of war-torn provinces, begins a slow revival, with markets reopening, trade routes cautiously re-established, and a sense of cautious optimism filtering through towns and cities scarred by decades of intermittent occupation and pillage. Meanwhile, England faces a different reality, one where the memory of heroic campaigns mingles with the bitter taste of loss, where the prestige of knights and nobles is tarnished by repeated setbacks, and where the crown must navigate the fragile balance between honoring veterans, placating discontented barons, and maintaining authority over a restless populace still smarting from military expenditure and conscription. The social and cultural impacts of the 100 Years' War, often overlooked amid tales of kings and battles, are equally profound. Population displacement, shifts in agricultural practices, the rise of local militias and regional defense networks, and a collective consciousness shaped by uncertainty, loyalty, and survival. Chroniclers of the time, writing in the quiet aftermath. Note the subtle transformations in language, literature, and identity, capturing a nation's attempt to make sense of the chaos and loss it has endured, preserving both the heroic and the tragic in the tapestry of memory. And yet, even as peace settles, uneasy and incomplete, questions linger like ghosts across the fields and villages. How much of the conflict's legacy will fade with the passing generation? And how much will imprint itself on the political, cultural, and psychological fabric of both nations? From the ashes of war, new power structures, social dynamics, and ambitions begin to emerge, setting the stage for future conflicts and transformations, leaving us to wonder whether the 100 Years' War ever truly ends, or if its echoes quietly shape the destiny of England, France, and the very notion of what it means to be at war. As the smoke of Castellon clears and the armies recede into memory, we are drawn to the subtle, often overlooked reverberations of the 100 Years' War, the ways in which a century of conflict reshaped the very identity of nations, the rhythms of daily life, and the consciousness of entire populations. In France, the lingering presence of English garrisons in the early years had created pockets of resentment and collaboration, leaving communities fractured and wary of outsiders, while local lords and peasants alike learned to navigate shifting allegiances, where survival often depended less on loyalty to a crown than on pragmatic choices dictated by circumstance. Economically, the war's legacy is etched into the soil itself, fields left fallow, villages abandoned, and trade networks disrupted for decades, forcing new patterns of commerce and agriculture, encouraging resilience and innovation in some regions, while in others, poverty and stagnation persistently shadowed recovery. Culturally, the war imprinted itself on language, literature, and identity. Chronicles, chansons to jest, and ballads preserved tales of valor, tragedy, and cunning, shaping notions of heroism, national pride, and the moral complexities of conflict, while ordinary citizens absorbed in quieter ways lessons about endurance, fear, and the unpredictable nature of fate. England, facing the disillusion of defeat, turned increasingly inward, its monarchy preoccupied with consolidating authority, navigating the ambitions of powerful barons and managing succession crises, all while grappling with the financial strain left by campaigns abroad, leading to social unrest, shifting class tensions, and the slow, simmering build-up toward the internal conflicts that would erupt in the Wars of the Roses across both nations. The psychological footprint of the war is profound yet intangible. The pervasive memory of sieges, famine, and loss influenced generations, altering perceptions of honor, strategy, and diplomacy, while local communities, scarred and resilient, developed new forms of governance, collective identity, and cultural expression, often blending the remnants of medieval traditions with innovations born from necessity. Even as kings signed treaties and banners were lowered, the human cost of over a century of intermittent warfare lingered, whispering in the stones of ruined castles, in the tales of survivors, in the cautious eyes of children growing up in a world still haunted by uncertainty. And so, as we contemplate the final echoes of this vast, turbulent conflict, one must ask, how does a nation truly heal after a war that spans generations, that reshapes not just borders, but the very hearts and minds of its people? What lessons, what scars, what stories endure when the last sword is sheathed and the battlefield falls silent, leaving only memory, reflection, and the quiet persistence of life moving forward in the shadow of history. And now, as we reach the final threads of the 100 Years' War, we step into a landscape forever altered, where the echoes of battles fought and lives lost ripple subtly through the centuries, shaping the destinies of France and England in ways both visible and unseen. The Treaty of Picquigny and other subsequent agreements may have drawn official lines on maps, but the human experience of the conflict persisted far longer, woven into family histories, regional rivalries, and the stories passed from parent to child, from village elder to wandering minstrel. Military innovation, honed in the fires of prolonged warfare, left a lasting imprint. The longbow artillery and professionalized infantry became cornerstones of European armies, while tactics refined over decades informed future conflicts, blurring the line between victory and stalemate, between heroism and tragedy. Beyond the battlefield, the war accelerated social and economic transformation. Feudal structures weakened under the pressure of taxation, recruitment, and the sudden mortality of knights and nobles, opening spaces for commoners to rise in influence. While towns expanded, trade routes recovered and adapted, and new centers of power emerged from the ruins of old hierarchies. The cultural memory of the Warwick's epic stories of Joan of Arc, Edward the Black Prince, and countless unnamed soldiers continues to captivate, reminding us that history is not only a record of dates and treaties, but a tapestry of emotion, fear, courage, and endurance, stitched together in chronicles, poems, and paintings that convey both grandeur and grief. Yet, perhaps most haunting of all is the psychological residue left on a continent that endured over 100 years of uncertainty. Generations who grew up under the shadow of siege and skirmish, whose lives were punctuated by the unpredictable swings of fortune, whose understanding of loyalty, honor, and nationhood was forged in the crucible of constant threat. As we close this chapter, the question lingers, inviting reflection: can the human spirit fully reconcile with a past defined by endless conflict? Or do the memories of war remain, quietly shaping the collective consciousness in ways we cannot entirely measure? Sit back, relax, and let the weight of centuries settle around you. For the 100 Years' War may have ended on parchment and in parliaments, but its shadows, its lessons, and its stories continue to whisper, inviting us to listen, to imagine, and to remember long after the last trumpet has faded into silence. The war is over, yet its presence remains, like a distant drumbeat beneath the calm, reminding us that history is never truly gone. It waits, patient and eternal, for those willing to hear its story.